Victor Langford, the most famous pianist in the hall, spotted a quiet woman in janitor clothes gently wiping the $180,000 Steinway grand piano before the gala began. He smirked, grabbed the microphone, and said to the crowd, "Looks like we've got a secret pianist tonight." Laughter filled the concert hall as he challenged her to play a passage from Liszt's La Campanella, one of the hardest piano pieces ever written, just for fun. The woman, Emily Carter, slowly walked to the stage while hundreds watched, expecting a disaster. Victor leaned back, smiling, already enjoying the joke. Emily placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang out. Perfect. The room went silent. A professor in the front row suddenly whispered, "Wait, that's impossible." Victor's smile froze, because the woman he mocked had just started playing like a legend. Victor Langford believed that after 30 years on the world's greatest stages, he had seen every kind of amateur who thought they could play the piano. But on that night in New York, he was about to discover how wrong he could be. The grand concert hall glowed beneath towering crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting across polished marble floors and the deep black shine of a $180,000 Steinway grand piano placed proudly at center stage. It was the annual charity gala of the Manhattan Classical Society, an evening where wealthy patrons in tailored tuxedos and elegant gowns gathered to celebrate music at its highest level. At the center of it all stood Victor Langford, the legendary concert pianist whose performances had filled Carnegie Hall for decades. At 62, Victor carried the quiet arrogance of a man who had spent a lifetime hearing audiences rise to their feet for him. Tonight was no different. Hundreds of guests filled the velvet seats, their conversations buzzing with admiration as Victor concluded a brilliant performance of Chopin, the final note still lingering in the air like perfume. Applause erupted, echoing off the tall gold-trimmed walls. Victor stood slowly, offering a modest bow that didn't quite hide the pride in his eyes. He loved moments like this, the admiration, the attention, the silent acknowledgement that he was the best pianist in the room. But as the applause faded and the audience settled, Victor's gaze drifted toward the edge of the stage where a quiet figure moved carefully near the piano. She wore plain clothes, simple gray slacks, a faded blue work shirt, and practical shoes meant for long hours on her feet. A janitor's cleaning cloth rested in her hand as she gently wiped a small fingerprint from the piano's polished surface. Most people barely noticed her. To the elegant crowd, she was just part of the staff, invisible in the background like the stage lights or the velvet curtains. Her name was Emily Carter, and she had spent the entire evening moving silently through the building, cleaning hallways, polishing railings, and making sure the grand hall looked perfect for the city's most prestigious music event. Yet as Victor watched her, something caught his attention. For a brief moment, Emily's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the piano keys, almost like someone greeting an old friend. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Victor saw it. A small smile crept across his face, the kind that appears when someone believes they've just discovered an amusing opportunity. He leaned toward the microphone again, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Well now," he said with playful amusement, drawing curious glances from the audience. "It seems we have another admirer of the Steinway tonight." Soft laughter rippled through the hall as dozens of heads turned toward the quiet woman beside the piano. Emily froze slightly, clearly not expecting attention. Victor's smile widened. "Tell me," he continued, resting one hand casually on the piano lid, "do you play?" The audience chuckled again. It was harmless fun, the kind wealthy crowds enjoyed between performances. Emily hesitated, her eyes moving briefly toward the hundreds of faces watching her now. For a moment, the entire room waited for her answer. And Victor Langford, completely certain of how this little joke would end, gestured politely toward the piano bench and said, "Why don't you show us?" Emily Carter stood beside the piano as hundreds of eyes locked onto her, the soft laughter in the room lingering like an echo that refused to fade. The bright stage lights suddenly felt far too strong for someone who had spent the entire evening quietly polishing railings and wiping down marble counters. Victor Langford watched her carefully, his expression relaxed, almost entertained, like a seasoned performer who had just invited a volunteer on stage during a show. The audience leaned forward with curiosity, some smiling politely, others whispering to one another as if they had been given a brief moment. of unexpected entertainment during an otherwise formal evening. Emily lowered her cleaning cloth slowly, folding it carefully in her hands as if buying herself a few seconds to think. She glanced at the long row of black and white keys resting beneath the golden stage lights. The Steinway grand piano gleamed like a museum piece, flawless and intimidating, the kind of instrument that serious musicians dreamed about playing their entire lives. For a moment she said nothing. The silence stretched just long enough for several guests in the front rows to exchange amused looks. Victor tilted his head slightly and gestured again toward the bench with exaggerated politeness. His voice carried easily across the room as he said, "Come now, do not be shy. Music is meant to be shared." A few people chuckled again, though the laughter felt softer this time. Emily finally looked up, her calm blue eyes meeting Victor's confident gaze. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet steadiness that made her seem strangely composed for someone standing under the spotlight without warning. She took a small step closer to the piano, the polished floor reflecting her movement. The room felt noticeably quieter as the rustling conversations faded. Some guests expected her to refuse. Others assumed she might press a few random keys before quickly leaving the stage. After all, this was a room filled with patrons who supported the highest levels of classical performance. None of them imagined that the quiet janitor beside the piano belonged anywhere near it. Emily gently placed her cleaning cloth on the corner of the instrument and moved toward the piano bench. The soft creak of the wooden seat was almost the only sound in the hall as she sat down. Victor folded his arms loosely, a faint smile still resting on his face as if he had just set the stage for a harmless joke. The audience leaned forward with growing curiosity. Some lifted their phones slightly, anticipating an awkward moment that might be amusing later. Emily rested her hands lightly in her lap, studying the keyboard in front of her with careful attention. Her breathing slowed, steady and controlled. Then Victor spoke again, his tone playful but clearly confident in the outcome. "Let us make it interesting," he said, walking a few steps closer to the piano so the entire room could hear him clearly. "Why? Do not we try something challenging?" He paused, scanning the audience with a performer's instinct for drama before continuing. Franz Liszt. La Campanella. A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the hall. Even accomplished pianists considered that piece a technical mountain. Victor gestured lightly toward the sheet music resting on the piano stand. "If you can manage even the first few measures," he added with an amused smile, "I believe everyone here would be very impressed." The crowd waited, certain that the moment would end exactly as Victor expected. But Emily Carter did not respond with embarrassment or hesitation. Instead, she slowly lifted her hands from her lap and placed her fingers gently above the keys. And for the first time since stepping onto the stage, the quiet woman allowed herself the smallest, almost invisible smile. Emily Carter's fingers hovered just above the piano keys, while the enormous concert hall waited in quiet anticipation. The polished Steinway reflected the stage lights like a dark mirror, and the audience leaned forward with the subtle excitement people feel when they expect something awkward to happen. Victor Langford stood only a few feet away, watching with calm confidence, his arms folded lightly across his chest. In his mind, the moment was already finished. He imagined a few clumsy notes, perhaps nervous laughter, and then a polite round of applause before the evening returned to serious music. That was how moments like this usually ended. But Emily Carter did not rush. She studied the keyboard the way a seasoned driver studies a familiar road before turning the engine. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. The crowd noticed the change even if they could not explain it. Something about her posture shifted from uncertainty to quiet focus. The faint whispering in the audience gradually faded as people began to sense that this was no longer simply a joke. Emily lifted her hands slightly higher, her fingertips floating over the black and white keys with delicate precision. For a brief second, the room was so silent that the soft hum of the stage lighting could be heard above the audience. Then her fingers moved. The first note rang out clear and bright, echoing through the hall like the strike of a small silver bell. Several heads lifted instantly. The tone was flawless. Emily's second note followed without hesitation, then a third, then a quick cascade that danced lightly across the upper keys. The unmistakable opening of La Campanella began to unfold. A man in the front row who taught piano at a prestigious conservatory straightened in his seat. His eyebrows rose slightly as he listened more carefully. Across the aisle, a young music student who had struggled with that exact piece for months leaned forward, suddenly uncertain about what he was hearing. Emily's hands moved with surprising confidence, gliding from one end of the keyboard to the other with smooth control. The delicate high notes shimmered like tiny bells while the lower chords anchored the melody with steady strength. Victor Langford's faint smile began to weaken. He had expected hesitation, perhaps a stumble within the first few measures. Instead, the rhythm remained precise. The tempo remained perfect. Emily's fingers moved faster now, effortlessly navigating the complex leaps that made the piece so feared among pianists. A quiet ripple passed through the audience as whispers returned, this time filled with confusion instead of amusement. Accomplished pianists, filled with rapid leaps, delicate trills, and lightning-fast passages that demanded years of disciplined training. Yet Emily's fingers moved across the keyboard with calm precision, each note landing exactly where it belonged. Victor Langford stood beside the instrument, but the confident amusement that had been on his face moments earlier had slowly disappeared. His eyes followed her hands closely now. The movements were efficient, controlled, and unmistakably professional. There was no hesitation, no searching for the next note, no visible tension in her wrists. Every gesture suggested long familiarity with the instrument. A quiet murmur spread through the front rows as a gray-haired conductor whispered something to the woman seated beside him. She shook her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the stage. Emily continued without looking at the audience. Her focus remained entirely on the keyboard. Her shoulders relaxed as the melody climbed higher and higher. The complex right-hand passages sparkled like tiny bells while her left hand anchored the rhythm with steady confidence. The music filled the hall in waves, and something unexpected began to happen. The audience stopped seeing a janitor in simple clothes. Instead, they saw a musician completely absorbed in the language of the piano. One guest who had been smiling earlier now lowered his program slowly, his expression changing to disbelief. Another guest whispered under his breath, asking if she had studied at Juilliard. Victor took another step closer, his posture stiffening slightly as the performance continued. He knew this piece better than most people alive. He had performed it in front of thousands of audiences across the world. And what he was hearing now did not sound like an amateur repeating memorized notes. It sounded like interpretation. Emily shaped the melody with subtle dynamics, allowing certain phrases to breathe while guiding others forward with gentle momentum. It was the kind of musical instinct that came only from years of deep understanding. A young piano student in the balcony suddenly leaned over the railing, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to his friend. He said that the timing was perfect. Down below, the gray-haired conductor slowly removed his glasses as if he needed to hear more clearly. Emily reached the most demanding section of the piece, where the right hand must leap rapidly across the keyboard in quick, sparkling bursts. Many pianists stumbled there. Victor himself had seen seasoned performers lose control at that moment. But Emily's hands moved with astonishing accuracy, striking each note cleanly before flowing effortlessly to the next phrase. For the first time since the challenge had begun, Victor Langford felt a quiet uncertainty settle into his chest. Because the longer she played, the more obvious the truth became. This performance was not an accident. And somewhere deep in the room, a memory was beginning to stir among the musicians who had been listening very carefully. Emily Carter's hands continued moving across the piano with quiet confidence as the final pages of La Campanella approached. The music filled the concert hall with a brilliance that seemed almost unreal, every note sparkling with clarity beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers above. What had begun as a playful challenge had now transformed into a moment that no one in the audience could look away from. People who had once leaned back comfortably were now sitting upright, their eyes fixed on the stage. The soft murmurs that had filled the hall earlier had disappeared completely. In their place was a silence so deep that even the faint echo of the piano strings could be heard drifting through the air. Victor Langford stood beside the instrument, but his posture had changed. His arms were no longer folded. Instead, his hands hung loosely at his sides as he watched Emily with growing disbelief. The confident smile that had once rested on his face had vanished entirely. He knew the structure of this piece better than almost anyone alive. Every rapid leap, every delicate trill, every demanding sequence had been engraved into his memory after decades of performance. Yet Emily's interpretation carried something that surprised him. It was not just accuracy. It was understanding. She shaped the melody with subtle emotion, guiding the phrases forward with the calm authority of someone who had lived with the music for many years. Her fingers moved lightly over the keys, never striking harder than necessary, allowing the Steinway to sing with natural warmth. A woman seated near the front row slowly placed her hand over her mouth as the realization began to settle in. The quiet janitor playing the piano did not simply know the piece. She mastered it. Across the aisle, the gray-haired conductor who had removed his glasses earlier now leaned closer to the stage, studying Emily's hands with intense focus. A faint line formed across his forehead, as if he were trying to unlock a distant memory. Something about her technique seemed familiar. The graceful way her right hand floated over the high notes, the relaxed control in her wrists, the balanced phrasing between melody and harmony. It reminded him of someone he had once watched perform on a much larger stage many years ago. In the balcony, a young music student whispered again to his friend, his voice trembling with excitement as he said that the tempo was flawless. Down below, another musician quietly shook his head in disbelief. Victor Langford took one slow step backward as Emily reached the final section of the composition. The most difficult passage arrived like a storm of bright notes cascading across the keyboard. Her hands moved faster now, traveling the full length of the piano in brilliant arcs. Each leap landed perfectly, every note ringing clean and clear. It was the kind of control that even seasoned concert pianists sometimes struggled to maintain under pressure. But Emily Carter showed no sign of strain. Her expression remained calm, almost peaceful, as if she had stepped into a world where the audience no longer existed. The music rose higher and higher until the final notes approached like the last flashes of light before sunrise. And somewhere within the silent hall, the gray-haired conductor suddenly straightened in his seat as a name surfaced in his mind, a name that had not been spoken in the classical world for nearly 20 years. Emily Carter's fingers swept across the final cascading passage of La Campanella with breathtaking control, the bright notes ringing through the concert hall like a storm of silver bells. The Steinway responded to every touch, each tone clear and perfectly balanced beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers. No one in the audience moved. Hundreds of people sat frozen in their seats, their eyes fixed on the quiet woman at the piano, as if they were witnessing something that should not have been possible. The last sequence approached, the most delicate ending of the entire piece, where precision mattered more than power. Emily's hands slowed slightly, guiding the melody toward its final line with gentle confidence. Then the last notes sounded, soft and brilliant at the same time, lingering in the air for a long breath, before fading into silence. And the hall did not react. For nearly 3 seconds no one clapped, no one spoke, no one even shifted in their seat. The silence felt heavier than applause. Victor Langford stood beside the piano as if rooted to the stage floor. His mind raced through what he had just heard. Every passage had been flawless, not merely correct, but expressive, balanced, and confident in a way that only years of disciplined performance could produce. This had not been luck. It had not been imitation. It had been mastery. Across the front row, the gray-haired conductor suddenly leaned forward sharply in his seat. His eyes widened as the memory that had been forming in the back of his mind finally broke into focus. He whispered something under his breath, almost as if he did not believe his own realization. The woman seated beside him turned quickly, asking what he had said. But he did not answer her right away. Instead, he kept staring at Emily Carter, studying the calm way she lifted her hands from the keys and allowed them to rest gently in her lap. That posture, that relaxed control. He had seen it once before, many years earlier, on a stage far larger than this one. Slowly he removed his glasses again and spoke the name out loud, though his voice was barely louder than a breath. Emily Carter. The woman beside him frowned slightly as she repeated the name quietly, trying to place it. Then her eyes widened. A ripple of whispers began spreading through the first rows like a quiet wind moving across water. The name traveled from one musician to another, passed carefully, as if it were a fragile secret. Some guests looked confused, but others suddenly leaned forward with recognition growing on their faces. 20 years earlier, the classical music world had been captivated by a young pianist who critics called the most brilliant talent of her generation. Concert halls across America had sold out months in advance just to hear her perform. Newspapers had described her interpretations as fearless and deeply emotional, the kind of artistry that appeared only once in a lifetime. And then one day, she had disappeared without explanation. No farewell performance. No public announcement. Just silence. Victor Langford felt a chill move slowly through his chest as the whispers around him grew louder. Because the name that had begun circulating through the audience was not unfamiliar to him. In fact, it was a name he had not heard spoken in almost 2 decades. And now, standing only a few feet away from the piano, Victor slowly turned his gaze back toward the quiet woman who had just finished playing, suddenly realizing that the janitor he had invited on stage might not have been a stranger to the world of music at all. The concert hall remained silent for a long moment after Emily Carter finished speaking, the weight of her quiet explanation settling gently across the audience. The chandeliers above continued to glow warmly, reflecting across the polished black surface of the Steinway piano where her hands had just moved with such effortless mastery. No one rushed to interrupt the moment. Even the applause that had filled the room minutes earlier seemed to pause out of respect for the calm presence standing beside the instrument. Victor Langford slowly lifted the microphone again, but this time there was no trace of the playful arrogance that had colored his voice earlier in the evening. Instead, there was something far more rare on a stage like this. There was humility. He looked toward Emily with a thoughtful expression before addressing the audience in a steady voice. He said that in all his years performing across the world, he had rarely witnessed a moment that reminded him so clearly why music mattered. Not because of fame or reputation, but because true artistry had a way of appearing when people least expected it. A quiet murmur of agreement passed through the audience as listeners absorbed his words. Victor then turned slightly toward Emily and said that the stage belonged to her tonight if she wished to remain there. The offer hung gently in the air, but Emily simply smiled in a calm and almost shy way that felt very different from the dramatic reactions the crowd might have expected. She shook her head softly and stepped away from the piano bench, as if the moment had already given her everything she needed. Her voice carried across the hall again, gentle but clear, as she said that music had never truly left her life. She had simply chosen to live it in quieter places, teaching children who could not afford lessons, helping young students discover the joy hidden inside their first melodies. And sometimes, on quiet evenings after the hall had emptied, she played for herself while the lights were dim and no audience remained to judge the sound. The audience listened with growing admiration as the picture slowly formed in their minds. The legendary pianist the world once searched for had not vanished because her talent had faded. She had simply stepped away from the noise of fame to keep music close to its simplest meaning. The gray-haired conductor nodded slowly, understanding now that her absence had never been a disappearance. It had been a choice. Emily glanced one last time at the Steinway grand piano before lifting her cleaning cloth from the corner where she had left it. The gesture was small, but deeply symbolic. The crowd watched in silence as she prepared to step away from the stage exactly the way she had entered it, without ceremony or attention. Yet something in the room had already changed. The people who had gathered there to celebrate famous performers had just witnessed a reminder that greatness did not always announce itself with titles or headlines. Sometimes it stood quietly in the background until the right moment arrived. Audience in a steady voice. He said that in all his years performing across the world, he had rarely witnessed a moment that reminded him so clearly why music mattered. Not because of fame or reputation, but because true artistry had a way of appearing when people least expected it. A quiet murmur of agreement passed through the audience as listeners absorbed his words. Victor then turned slightly toward Emily and said that the stage belonged to her tonight if she wished to remain there. The offer hung gently in the air, but Emily simply smiled in a calm and almost shy way that felt very different from the dramatic reactions the crowd might have expected. She shook her head softly and stepped away from the piano bench, as if the moment had already given her everything she needed. Her voice carried across the hall again, gentle but clear, as she said that music had never truly left her life. She had simply chosen to live it in quieter places, teaching children who could not afford lessons, helping young students discover the joy hidden inside their first melodies. And sometimes, on quiet evenings after the hall had emptied, she played for herself while the lights were dim and no audience remained to judge the sound. The audience listened with growing admiration as the picture slowly formed in their minds. The legendary pianist the world once searched for had not vanished because her talent had faded. She had simply stepped away from the noise of fame to keep music close to its simplest meaning. The gray-haired conductor nodded slowly, understanding now that her absence had never been a disappearance. It had been a choice. Emily glanced one last time at the Steinway grand piano before lifting her cleaning cloth from the corner where she had left it. The gesture was small, but deeply symbolic. The crowd watched in silence as she prepared to step away from the stage exactly the way she had entered it, without ceremony or attention. Yet something in the room had already changed. The people who had gathered there to celebrate famous performers had just witnessed a reminder that greatness did not always announce itself with titles or headlines. Sometimes it stood quietly in the background until the right moment arrived. Victor Langford remained beside the piano as Emily walked toward the edge of the stage. And as the audience slowly began to applaud again, this time softer and more thoughtful than before, one truth settled gently across the entire hall. Respect had finally replaced the laughter that started the evening, and everyone present would remember the moment they nearly mistook a legend for someone ordinary.